I thank Gennaro for his overview, that also with an analysis of the different works that has been developed in this field definitely helped to, depict the picture about this tool in the framework of remaining within the Eurozone. About this, I will spend a few words before introducing our second speaker, that is Luca Fantacci. No, Glenn Victor Kim, you close. Okay, perfect. We will have Glenn Victor Kim and then Luca Fantacci. Regarding the fact that we see that the two proposals share the idea that these currencies should be used in a certain sense. In the first proposal, we need also the fiscal multiplier, because if the fiscal multiplier is not big enough, you eventually are just moving the problem of the deficit creation later on in the future. The second one, in a certain sense, abandoned the banking system and just moved towards the real economy in a certain sense. On this point, I just shared with you the fact, and this is an important, I think, consideration that you can definitely insert in your researches if you think that is relevant. The fact that within the Eurozone, the financial economy is something like 10 times the real one. I used to say with an example that you can have the idea or the impression that the euro is still there because you take a coffee and pay €1 in Madrid, Paris, or Rome, or Milan. Unfortunately, I give you the bad news that the euro does no longer exist within the financial system. Because due to the collateral discrimination and due to the fact that every repo transaction, it has a different way of working of the financial institution according to the collateral and the kind of bonds that you put besides the transaction, it is clear that within the financial system we have already euro lira, euro mark, euro franc, euro pesetas, and in fact, it is not the case that within the financial system, through the spread, the financial system evaluate the risk of redenomination of the public debt, of German public debt in mark, in lira, or whatever, and you can compute also the implied probability. You have also some financial instruments in the Quanto CDS or the ISDA spread that allow you to compute the probability of the euro breakup, the fact that one country or another will leave the Eurozone. So what I want to say is that we don't have to under-evaluate the fact that any decision taken in the real world would be evaluated by financial markets and financial institutions. And they will evaluate the fiscal multiplier for the first proposal, and they will evaluate the turnover for the second one. And according to their evaluation, sic stantibus rebus, they will evaluate what should be the spread for our public debt by considering the potential deficit impact of a similar decision. And then we come back to the consideration that I said at the beginning in the morning. In a world so interconnected, where all the decision starts chain reactions, what is more important, the chain reaction is very difficult to forecast. It has to be really analyzed carefully, this, unknown situation, because everything could have impacts that can completely go out of control. And with these considerations, I will ask Luca Fantacci to add all these considerations and results of his very deep research in this field. Not Luca, sorry, Glenn Victor Kim, and this is the second one. I'm becoming tired too, maybe, to this debate in order that we can enrich our views on this important tool.
Good afternoon, everyone.
If you want to,
I don't have slides. So either way.
As you like.
As you
As you like. Maybe that you better dominate the audience. They are really exhausted. Thank you very much for this. I appreciate it. Sì, ti metto lo sfondo. And in this way, you have also the background.
Good afternoon, everyone. And thank you, Marcella, for addressing this opportunity. I was asked basically to give some comments on this program for today, relying upon certain experiences that I've had in the past several years, where I had served on the advisory committee to the then Greek finance minister, Yanis Varoufakis. As you probably know, it was a relatively short period during his serving in the government, and therefore it was a relatively short period for myself and my team to provide any advice or guidance. That being said, today's discussion in respect of fiscal currencies, that was one of the many projects with which we had spent some time in exploring. So what I would like to just present, and because these are more practical matters that we were confronting, and as I'm not an economist, I will refrain from opining on the econometric pros and cons and leave that to a rather distinguished group of folks who are far better placed to share those thoughts. Instead, I'd like to confine my section very simply into the insights and perspectives made during this period. And I think it would be very easy to say that if a fiscal currency could be seen as a tool to enhance prospects for economic recovery, this was primarily the objective that we were pursuing. And where traditional tools, and this is especially true where traditional tools were not available to Greece at the time, or currently for that matter, that by meaning having exchange rate policy control, nor monetary policy. So these were, as you know, not readily available at the time, and had therefore limited the ability and the scope for the government to pursue ideas that would otherwise be deemed no longer available to them. Many of you are aware that there exists a reasonable body of literature on fiscal currencies. Janata mentioned that there was over 30 different proposals that were made at the time. And we had the opportunity to, in a very limited period, to essentially digest whether this could actually be done. So what can I share with you about fiscal currencies from this period? Many of you know that the economy, and if you rewind the tape back to early July of 2015, the economy was essentially in free fall. We had spiraling unemployment, we had diminishing tax revenues, we had accruing of arrears, all of these components many of you are more than amply familiar with. But all of it comes down to the austerity program that was proposed and implemented under the official sector program of reform administered by the Troika. But you also have to appreciate that the societal fabric at the time was very much strained. We had protests almost daily. If you will, the glue that held the society together was really being pulled apart largely on a day-to-day basis. So our team was asked, in this type of environment, how can a fiscal currency operate? And how would we begin this exercise and be able to administer it in such a short period of time? You have to also appreciate that we had at that time a very weak administrative capacity. And what that means is that essentially the government, the Syriza government 1, let's call it, inherited an entire architecture of administration which was not theirs. It was not even the previous government. I mean, may I remind you that by this point, the Greek population had tried center-right, center-left, technocratic. They've tried pretty much everything, and now they had a left-wing government. So the administrative capacity was actually very low. And its ability to administer in a place where the civil service is rather large was modest, to say the least. We also had, you also have to appreciate that the population, relatively speaking, was financially, what's the right word? Unsophisticated. The use of internet banking was almost zero. Use of credit cards was very modest. And it became very much a hand-to-mouth type of society. So from this basis, what do you really do? And I might also add that it's hard to appreciate, but you also have a population that is dispersed over, of the 600 plus odd islands, it was inhabited by 200 plus. So we also had this sort of physical element to overcome. So what were the key questions that we tried to hit first and foremost? Number one, what was the legal feasibility? There was a Greek law that dates back to 1927 that prevented the state from being in a position to issue or reissue money of any type. And that the key word here was that it was not to issue money as it was defined by Gennaro as a means of payment, unit of account, or store of value. Furthermore, it could not be denominated in what we know as a euro. In other words, if we were to pursue any idea that looked like a fiscal currency, it would have to have this dynamic. It would have to look like, feel like, and smell like a euro without being one. And that was one of the other limitations that we had to start with. And furthermore, we had a problem of what I would describe as time, because there was very limited time, and purpose, because again, you could not call it a legal tender. It could not be used and purposed for all things. So what we did quickly was to say that, look, we'll start off, in order to try to keep it simple, we would put a date. So these were dated, if you will, fiscal currencies. And that quickly established our legal out. Number two, we would also have it purposeful, that it would be designed whereby on this piece of, let's say, coupon, that it would actually give you a stated purpose, and a single stated purpose. We thought that the right way to take, and this is the same departure point with Gennaro, was that it would be in tax, that these would be tax payable. That way, so these certificates, like a coupon you would receive for food coupons or other, that it would be designed very, very specifically, and it would have an expiry date. So, what about the implementation challenges? By far, and I think this has been emphasized on a number of different speakers today, was trust. Because you have, again, a skittish, very heterogeneous society who is spread across a lot of islands, who do not have as much, if you will, direct communication with the government. How would you possibly enable a opening or rolling out of a new product that is supposed to look, act, and feel like money, but without being money? By far, this would be the biggest challenge for us, and one that actually became, if you will, the principal reason why we were unable to do this. But let me share with you how the rollout was to be conceived. The idea was that we needed to address the question of how do you possibly bring this new product into the hands of individual citizens. Now, we also knew that at the outset we could not do this with every citizen, not 11 million of them anyway. So we focused on the one sector that we had an ability to reach out to, which was the public sector employees. That was that alone was over 500,000 people at the time. We also needed to know that whatever the program would look like, I would describe it as it had to pass the 8-year-old test, that an 8-year-old child should be able to understand what it is we're doing and be able to articulate it in 2 sentences. And if it did not achieve that test, it was unlikely to be able to be explained to anyone else, especially in that period. The 8-year-old, by the way, was my son. And he basically said, in very simple words, that it has to, if it's going to look, feel, act, and smell like money, it has to be provided in hard currency. And what I mean by that is we explored format as a problem. Hard, soft, physical, electronic. Our ultimate choice at that time was that it could only be physical if it was going to be launched at all. The simple reason, as I said earlier, there was limited internet use. Banks were already having challenges. We would have had to have the banks themselves subscribe to this entire view from the outset, which was unclear at the time. So instead, we chose a much more traditional, simpler, and altogether perhaps elegant in its own simplicity, was to think about it in a physical form. So we thought about it again, and I keep using this analogy, we thought about it like food coupons were at one point. When I grew up in the States, you regularly had in newspapers discount coupons when you go to a grocery store, and they describe very clearly what the representative value was, but without saying that it's currency. And it told you how long it would be good for, and it would tell you the purpose. So along those lines, we try to identify a means to do this in physical form. And we also thought that this would have on the back the specific rules so that you knew when you could deliver, who you would deliver to, and what would be the value for. Again, it was a single purpose for taxes payable. This did not prevent any subsequent prospect of saying you could repurpose it later. All right? The thinking was that it left open the prospect that if you did a second issuance, you could expand, if you will, the role, but this was supposed to be a proof of concept. The second is that we wanted to keep it simple in the sense that the date that would be chosen, the termination date of the coupon, let's say, or expiry date, would be the same date as tax due. So this, again, the idea was to try to force usage, was to, in effect, make it so obvious that you would take this and present it to your tax authority in lieu of cash. And as I earlier referred, there was a cash shortage in the system, and that's one of the reasons why arrears were building up. So this was supposed to be a partial alleviation of this point. There was a question that was asked early on about what happens at the expiry? What if Grandpa Nikos did not show up on that day? What would happen? The idea is that in order to try to, again, encourage usage, the tax authority, if you surrendered these notes the day after or 2 days after or so forth, you would be reissued notes but with a discounted value, i.e. to encourage people to use it on the day as per. And so they would be exchanged for the next tax year. There was also a question about, well, what would happen, I mean, besides usage, how else would the use work? Well, the idea is that other financial intermediaries could, and these tax notes can pay for anybody's taxes, not the person necessarily who's the recipient. So the idea is that this would encourage potential financial intermediaries to step up and provide cash on that day to exchange for these coupons, and the coupons would then subsequently migrate from one holder to another holder, possibly with the use of cash then recirculating. Because at the time, you probably know, in early 2015, there was an increasing velocity of cash hoarding. So we also wanted to promote cash to flow more through the system, and this would be one means to do it, the multiplier component. So let me, I just want to close very quickly. What were the other points made? One of the questions would obviously be is how much? I mean, how much did you contemplate issuance of these notes? We didn't really come to a conclusion on that, and I'll leave it there. But the kind of hand rule that we were looking at is that you didn't want to flood the system on one day with an ocean of these notes. Further, it would have to accompany a mass education program. So we were kind of using as a hand rule 10% of one's wages of that particular period would be as much as these FCs could probably handle at that moment. Second question that was not addressed is who would manage all of this, right? This is, again, one of the reasons why we focused on having this for the tax bureau. because the tax bureau would be a logical place as to, if you will, give and then receive back. It also would be the natural place to have it surrendered to. This seemed to make the logical sense for us at the time. Well, we also looked for what were the denominations sort of questions someone asked. We were looking at in the hundreds because we thought that this could be a useful, if you will, barometer of how much could be used. It also would set the stage potentially to be used in other formats like paying for utilities or possibly paying for other taxes due. Was it going to be permanent? We thought it would be useful not to say that. We thought that the idea was that if we stated that this would be a permanent program rather than a pilot program, we could better test whether this would actually work in substance or in fact need to be modified in some other form, broadened in terms of use, or otherwise needed to be withdrawn entirely. So what happened? So obviously I'm not here to tell you that it worked. What I am here to tell you is that the principal problem we had was a combination of the following. Again, as I emphasized, this was a period of tremendous turmoil in the country. This period only lasted for 6 months or 7 months, really, during which time the then minister resigned from his office. We were, however, pretty reasonably close in terms of how one would implement it. I think there was the principle of keep it simple worked because we narrowed the range of use and enabled it still with options to grow it as the situation suited. Second issue, besides time, was level of preparedness. One question could be, did you have a printer in mind? We had no printer in mind. And we also, funny enough, had to pay the printer. And the printer would want euros to be paid to print. So again, this kind of a circular problem in of itself. And finally, the lack of resources. The lack of resources because ultimately this would require a phenomenally large, well-coordinated campaign that was not afforded a kind of wartime mentality. I mean, we really did not have the ability to roll such a thing out comprehensively and not lose the confidence of the very recipients with whom they would receive these. So lessons learned. If you're going to maximize the benefit of tools like fiscal currencies or otherwise, it really should be, and this is my own personal belief, be part of a larger integrated package. That it cannot be perceived as a silver bullet or an answer to all ills, but rather a singular tool in a suite of tools. And we felt that that would be the only way that it would make sense in a suite. And this suite, if you will, was one of the ones being developed. We also, and I could not help enough to say that you need a lot of planning. I mean, just a lot of planning. The planning required to think about printing, to think about distributing, to think about receiving, to think about, remember, we spoke, I referred to the physical form. That means we would have these certificates floating around in the marketplace with unsure, if you will, capture on the tax date, which would then make it difficult to determine how much more to offer in the next round. But this was a more straightforward choice than one to use electronically, which there would be, in our minds, a very high probability of failure because there could be computer glitches, the lack of the program to be defined, and even at that point, electronic payment for taxes in Greece was still very nascent. Let me see. Let me conclude by saying that there was a lot of different ideas being pursued at the time. This was probably one that had the greatest, if you will, legs because it was the simplest that we pursued. We found a great deal of, let's say, informal support from bankers, dealers, those who provided specific insights to elements, but never really saw the whole picture. I can say that me personally felt that it could have been done if it had been, again, planned in a much more considered fashion than one that was done on an ad hoc basis. But there's certainly merit, and I would look at this point to pass it on to Luca, but you know, from our perspective, although it was not pursued, it did not mean it couldn't be done if it had more time. Thank you.